And she will talk about deliberative coalition formation to change the status quo. I shall be following the chat, so if you have questions during the talk, you can write something there, and then I can interrupt Edith and get you to ask your question. Okay, Edith, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Rupak, for the introduction. Thanks for having me here. I'm not sure if this talk is a particularly great fit for this seminar series, but at least in my defense, I can say that, okay, this is a talk on voting, but it doesn't require any background in voting theory or game theory. It's pretty much from the first principles. So I hope it will be, well, both interesting and accessible. Okay, so let me start with a little bit of background in political science. So in political science, one of the major topics that is being studied is how political parties form coalitions in order to govern. And the popular model there is a spatial model. So the setup is typically that we think of political parties as agents or players in the game. And these parties either have positions, principled positions, in a multidimensional proposal space, or maybe more cynically, they decide which positions to adopt. Right? So when I'm talking about proposal space, I'm thinking things like, okay, so what sort of position do they support on various controversial issues? Whatever, which fraction of the budget should be spent on military spending, whether abortions should be kind of allowed or prohibited or some intermediate position. Right? So usually kind of political positions so can be described by a smallish number of dimensions. So you can think of each party as taking a position on each of these issues, right? And that determines the support of each party. So voters typically also have their positions and they tend to prefer parties that are similar to them. So what happens is parties either naturally have these positions or they adopt these positions. And then parties have their supporters and they aim to form a winning coalition to govern. Right? So a winning coalition would be one that is large enough to have their mandate to govern. So if you think about parties in the parliament, so it would be parties that constitute at least half of the parliament members or something like that. Okay, so when these parties form a coalition, so this coalition also has to adopt some sort of position in the issue space, which you can think of as being some kind of median of the positions of individual coalition members. Right? And the questions one can then ask is, so which coalitions are going to form, which positions are they going to adopt? Will this be the best? So which processes will lead to efficient coalition formation so that the most popular, the most supported position is actually supported by a coalition around this position? Right? And of course, this is a major topic in political science. There is very substantial literature. So it goes back to 1920s to the famous work of Elkind. So there's plenty of recent work on that as well. Okay, so that's the background. Now let me position what we do in this paper against this background. So like in this classic work, we assume that there's a proposal space. So it's a metric space, can be a finite or infinite subset of RD. For instance, so these are proposals that can be adopted by parties and by the voters. And each agent has an ideal point in this proposal space, which is her opinion. So for instance, which fraction of the budget should be spent on education? So whether there should be universal mask mandate or not, or something intermediate, this sort of thing. Okay, and in addition to that, and this is fairly unusual for the literature, there's a special point, which is the current situation, the status quo. Right, so the status quo is a specific point, so we can think of it as a 0 point. And what agents are interested in figuring out is whether the status quo is the best they can do, or if there's at least half of the agent, majority of agents, that can form a coalition around some outcome that is different from the status quo. Right, so if there is a way to move away from the status quo in a way that would be approved by the majority. Okay, and what we assume about our agents is that their highest priority is to understand if there is any change from the status quo, that there would be majority supported, and they're very open to the compromise, right? So they don't being open to compromise effectively means that they would be happy with building a large coalition around a position that is maybe just slightly better for them than the status quo, rather than having a small coalition closer to the ideal point. Okay, so more geometrically, so what we have in mind is agents with approval preferences. Okay, so here's a picture. So here's an image of what we want to do. So we have a reality, the status quo, the point R, and so here's a couple of voters, V1 and V2. So for each voter, there's a space of all proposals that they would prefer to the status quo, and this is everything that is closer to them than the status quo. So agent V1 would prefer everything inside of this circle to the status quo. Agent V2 would prefer everything inside her circle to the status quo. So if you look at the intersection, so these are positions they could both adopt that both of them would prefer to the status quo. So for any of the points in there, if there's any proposal kind of in the intersection of these two circles, they could adopt that proposal and form a coalition around it, which would be supported by them both. Okay, and we'll try to make it slightly more formal what it means for agents to be open to compromise later on. So for now, let me just say that agents' preferences are fundamentally approval preferences. So they approve everything that is better for them than the status quo, everything within their circle, but they don't distinguish among different things in that circle. Right? So we are not going to say that agent 1 prefers the center of the circle to the periphery, right? And neither does agent 2, right? So they're just happy with any change and they're willing to compromise, willing to adopt a point somewhere within their circle that can get a lot of support from other voters. Okay, so another way to think about it geometrically is in terms of which proposals can get support, right? So here's this proposal A, right? So it sits inside the circle of agent 1. So agent 1 supports it. It sits outside of the circle of agent 2. So agent 2 does not support it. So where do we find agents that support A? Well, geometrically, it's very simple to see. So we connect A and R, right? And then draw a perpendicular through the middle of that segment. And all agents that sit above this line, so they're all closer to A than to R. So they could potentially form a coalition around A. And all agents on the other side prefer R to A. So there's no way they can support A. Right? So we'll be kind of reasoning in terms of these circles and lines in what follows. Okay, so let's do an example. Right, so let's talk about the pandemic response. So I'm thinking of pandemic response as operating on two major axes. So one is what is open and what is closed, right? And that can range from only keeping the essential shops open. So let's say that this is the minimum amount of openness that the society needs to function, and up to, say, open nightclubs that are both inessential and potentially kind of a very bad for spreading COVID, right? So this is my openness axis, right? And there's another axis, which is masking axis, and that ranges from no masks whatsoever, no mask mandate of any kind, to masks everywhere, including on the streets and in the parks and on the beaches, kind of everywhere. Okay, so let's say, so suppose we are in, I'm not sure if I guess we are all geographically distributed. So let's think of the point R that would be, for instance, the UK in December, which would be somewhere halfway between these two extremes on both axes, right? So there would be things that were open beyond essential shops, but certainly nightclubs and large group activities would not be open, right? And there were requirements to wear masks on the buses and in the shops. But in the UK, there was never a requirement to wear a mask in the street, right? So that would be the current reality. Right. Okay. So this is my masking axis. Right. So some of these things are ordered somewhat arbitrarily, but generally this axis is supposed to go from no masking to universal masking. Right. And this is my openness axis. Right. And let's say we have voters who have different positions with regard to these two axes. So for instance, voter 1 is heavily opposed to any kind of mask mandate but also they don't want things to be broadly open, right? So they insist on no mask mandate, but they're fine with only takeaway food establishments being open and essential shops and not beyond that, right? And kind of on the other extreme, we have Agent 4 who wants everything to be open, but also insists on universal masking, right? And kind of all sorts of various positions. So let's try to think kind of how these agents can agree on majority supported change from the status quo. Right? And there are several possible ways to agree on something that is different from the status quo. So for instance, let's look at this horizontal line. Right? Agents who sit above that line, and there is a majority of agents above this line, right? They can agree on a proposal that sits, for instance, they can agree on the proposal that keeping the same level of masking, but opening cafes for eating in. Right? So all of them would be closer to this point than they are to R. Right? Meaning they can form a majority coalition that says, well, let's keep the same level of masking, but a little bit more openness, and they get majority support for that. Right? And here's another option. Right? Agents V3, V4, and V5, and to the right of this line, right? So they can form a majority coalition that argues for the same level of openness, but a slightly higher level of masking. Right? And the largest coalition we can plausibly form, so you can convince yourself that, you know, there is no way all 5 agents can agree on a change from status quo. Right? So geometrically, if you draw all the 5 circles, kind of with centers at 1, 2, 3, and 4, 3, 4, 5, there won't be a common point of intersection. But we can form a coalition of 4 agents. So for instance, agents 2, 3, 4, and 5 can agree on a point that would sit, well, here somewhere, right? Which would argue for a little bit more masking and a little bit more openness, right? And potentially there could also be another coalition involving 1, 2, 3, and 4 that would argue for a little bit less masking and a little bit more openness, right? So that would be kind of the most supported proposals, right? So there are different most supported proposals, and there are different coalitions supporting them, but we can get 4 agents to support change from the status quo. Okay, so what kind of coalition formation process do I have in mind? So the way I'm thinking about a coalition is a set of agents plus a position that they support, right? So this is the object that I'm going to call a deliberative coalition, right? And deliberative coalition can only form if all agents in the coalition prefer the proposal put forward by that coalition to the status quo. So for instance, in the previous slide, so I could form a coalition around opening cafes for eating in and the current level of masking, which would consist of V2, V3, and V4. Right? And the coalition structure now would be a partition of agents into these deliberative coalitions. Right? So each agent sits in exactly one coalition. Right? And each coalition has a proposal that it supports. Right? And then I'm thinking of this as being a dynamic process. So the agents start with some coalition structure, so possibly with each agent just being in a singleton coalition and arguing for his or her own ideal point. Right? And then agents slowly start forming coalitions, potentially changing their opinions. So what kind of transitions do we have in mind? Well, the simplest kind of transition we could look at would be single agent deviations. An agent moves from the coalition she's currently in to a different coalition. Right? So we could also think of position changes. A coalition currently supports a proposal and it changes to supporting a different proposal. Or perhaps 2 coalitions can merge, right, and decide on a new proposal to support. Or even more generally, 2 coalitions can merge, but maybe leave some members of each coalition behind if these members don't support the new proposal. So what can happen is that CP and C prime, P prime can join together around some new proposal P star, but not everyone in C and not everyone in C prime would support that new proposal. Right? So these are the type of transitions we'd like to reason about. Right? So ideally, we'd like to consider transitions that involve a limited number of coalitions, right? Because it's very difficult to hold negotiations among large number of coalitions. Right? So in particular, we would like to understand, for the most of the talk, I'll focus on transitions that only involve 2 coalitions at a time. And the goal would be to understand what coalition structures can arise. Okay, so I mentioned that our agents are compromise seeking. right? So they're compromise seeking, and their goal is to build a large coalition to move away from the status quo, right? So we think of agents of doing that myopically. So we say that agents favor larger coalitions so that the transition is only feasible if it leads to the formation of a larger coalition, right? So in that sense, for instance, if I have two agents, if I have two coalitions, one coalition is of size 3 and the other one is a coalition of size 5, then an agent from a smaller coalition can move to the larger coalition, right? Because then the moving agents would move from a coalition that was size 3 and the new coalition would be size 6, but not vice versa. Right, so agents who are now in coalition of size 5 wouldn't move to a coalition that is now of size 3. On the other hand, so it may happen that if we have two coalitions of size 4, an agent from the first coalition of size 4 would move to the second coalition of size 4, because now that coalition would be of size 5. Right, so agents favor larger coalitions, right? So they're myopically trying to build a majority-supported coalition that can change away from the status quo. Right, so to give you some intuition from that, if you notice the list of my co-authors on that project, right? So I had two Israeli co-authors, Udi Shapira and Nimrod Talmon, right? So if you've been following Israeli politics a little bit, right? So there's currently some coalition building in Israel to displace their current leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, right? And kind of this is the sort of inspiration, right? So pretty much everyone on the left in Israeli politics would be willing to form a coalition that changes away from the status quo. They don't insist kind of on any particular kind of change as long as it's in the right direction, but they do want to achieve change. Right? So this is the kind of setting we want to formalize. Okay, so this is our research question. So with these compromise-seeking agents, which types of transitions guarantee emergence of a coalition around one of the most supported outcomes? Right, so this is what we are going to call success. Right, so agents have these dynamics where they split, where they merge, where they move from one coalition to another, right? And the eventual goal as a group is to identify one of the most supported outcomes and build a coalition around it. Right? So what kind of transitions allow them to achieve this goal? Right, and of course the answer may depend on the metric space, and in what follows we're going to see how it actually depends on the metric space. Right? And there's a secondary question, kind of wearing our computer scientist hats, we ask if this convergence can be achieved after polynomial many transitions. Okay, so I'm afraid this was quite hand-wavy, so let me try to start making it a little bit more formal. Okay, so I already defined what is a deliberative coalition and deliberative coalition structure. So let me now talk a little bit more formally about transitions. Okay, so single agent transitions are of this form. So we have a coalition structure, right? And this coalition structure have a pair coalitions. Agents in coalition C support P. Agents in coalition C prime support P prime, right? And from there I can move to coalitions C union A and coalitions C prime minus A, right? So effectively this means that agent A, who used to be in coalition C prime, moves to coalition C. Okay, and this transition can only happen if coalition C was at least as large as coalition C prime. So agent A myopically increases the size of her coalition, and agent A approves B. Right? So what happens here is agent A looks at proposals of other coalitions, identifies a proposal that she approves, right? And observes that if she were to join this other coalition, she would be in a larger coalition than she is in currently, right? And then she decides to move. Right? So this is a single agent transition. A follow transition is a transition where we have two coalitions and they merge behind the proposal of one of these coalitions, right? So C supported P, C prime supported P prime, and now C and C prime merge and they support the proposal originally supported by C. And okay, so when can this happen? This can happen if all agents who are in coalition C prime are happy to be in a coalition that supports P. Right, so this move can only happen if all agents in this new coalition would actually support its proposal. Okay, and of course, so this coalition is beneficial for agents in C prime because the size of the new coalition is bigger than the original coalition. So they're happy to move because they approve the new proposal and this results in a bigger coalition. A slightly more general type of transition is merge transition. So it's almost the same as follow transition, except we allow the agents to adopt a new proposal. Right? So intuitively, this new proposal, P star, may be some sort of compromise between P and P star. Right? And again, we don't have to worry about coalition sizes because the merge increases the coalition size by definition. And again, so it can only happen if all members of both coalitions approve this new proposal, P star. Okay, so finally, our most general type of transition is what we call compromise transitions. Right? So those are slightly more complicated. So again, we start with two coalitions, one supporting P, another supporting P star. So they're going to move to a new proposal, P, one supports P, the other supports P prime, and they're going to move to a new proposal, P star. Right? But not everyone in C and not everyone in C prime is going to move to this new proposal. Right? So what's going to happen is in C, there's some subset C P prime who support this new proposal P star. In C prime, there is also a subset C prime P star, apologies for the notation, who support this new proposal P star. Right? So the agents from both coalitions who support P star are going to move to P star, and they may leave some agents behind in the old coalitions who would still support P and who would still support P prime. And for this move to happen, well, the agents who move have to support this new proposal P star, and also the coalition that they form should be bigger than any of the original coalitions. Right? So they break away from the old coalition partners to build a bigger coalition around the proposal they all approve. Well, so you can see that the theme here is that the new coalition should be bigger than the old coalition, and in any case, the coalition that forms is such that all members of that coalition approve its proposal. Right? So these are the four types of coalition transitions we are going to consider. Questions at this point? Complaints?
Hi, yeah, I have a question. So why don't agents do at least some local optimization? So for example, in the first transition, just pick the one with largest size of whose proposal you approve.
Right. Yeah. So we could consider that as well. Yeah. So that would make sense as well. So single. Yeah. So this is kind of better response rather than best response type of dynamics. I think many of our results would hold for that case as well. So you can also say that in case of follow transitions, right? So if there are several mergers available, they should go for the largest available merge. Right, so I think, yeah, so that would be a reasonable variant to be considered, but we are kind of conceptualize our agents as maybe having some secondary considerations beyond just maximizing the size. So this just gives them more freedom, right? So if we can prove convergence results in this more permissive framework, right? So I think that, right, so if we say that any sequence of single agent transitions as defined here is actually good, right? So that's a stronger result. Right, so but certainly what you propose would also make sense. Just not something we considered in the paper. And so maybe as we go through the proofs, I can try to think on the fly if it would work for this definition as well, but I'm not sure.
Okay, thanks, yeah.
Edith, if I may, can you explain, please, a little bit more the condition that cardinality of C is bigger or equal than the cardinality of C prime in the single agent transition? This condition prevents small coalitions from getting bigger. It kind of favors bigger coalitions.
Right. Yeah, so it favors bigger coalitions. And for one thing, it's important for convergence, right? So it helps that the process won't cycle. So we'll prove that formally in a second, but maybe it's obvious to you, right? But remember, our agents want to build a majority coalition, right? And this is just saying they're doing it myopically. They're not smart enough to figure out that maybe some sequence of these transitions will help eventually, right? So they just say, okay, if I can be in a bigger coalition in the next step, right? So this is something I'm going to prefer, right? So the smallest coalition can never grow. The second smallest coalition can still grow because agents from the smallest coalition can join it.
Yes, it is a model that the rich getting richer, so to speak, as already.
Yes, rich getting richer, but yes, I think it's, so we don't have any kind of splits here or moves to smaller coalitions. But I think if our agents are in the business of identifying kind of a group that can actually achieve change, it's not unreasonable for them to optimize that at every step, to try to get it, to try to build a bigger group.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. So on the other hand, agents, I would say that our agents are very nice to each other because they're willing to compromise, right? So they're willing to adopt proposals that are different from their optimal proposals. They're willing to adopt anything that they prefer to the status quo, right? So this thing P star here can be kind of quite far. So it may be the case that all agents in C are pretty tightly clustered around P. All agents in C prime are pretty closely clustered around P prime, yet they may be willing to adopt P star if it brings more people on board, right? So they're nice in that sense. Okay, so let's...
There is another question. Daniel, maybe you can just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, I just had a quick question about like the model formulation. So it seems like, so you're using this like the metric space structure just to determine what are like the sets of positions that an agent would approve, right? Since like it doesn't matter, it's sort of the distance beyond the distance from like the status quo. So I guess like what is the reason for, like, would it be equivalent to just like define a set of approval sets for each agent rather than having like this metric space structure?
So you will see this in the results, right? So the results will be different depending on the type of the metric space they live in, right? So basically the story will be that if everyone lives in a simple metric space, if these approvals are induced by a very simple kind of metric, then simple transitions guarantee successful deliberation, right? And if the metric space is more complex, then you need a richer kind of transitions, right? So in that sense, it's useful.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay, so I understand that this is vague, so hopefully we'll see some examples, we'll see some results. This will be helpful. Okay, so let's look, for instance, at this example. So we have the reality, the status quo in the center, right? So think of it as a metric in RD, right? So we have a bunch of proposals, A prime, B, B, C. So the proposals are in blue, the agents are in red, and this is the current coalition structure. So let's say, so we have V1, V2, and V3 forming a coalition around A, V4, V5, and V6 forming a coalition around B, and V7 forming a singleton coalition around C. Right, and let's say that these are the only proposals that are available. So in particular, agents are unable to articulate a proposal that would exactly correspond to their position. Right, so there is no proposal that sits exactly at V7. Right, so C is the closest proposal to agent 7 that agent 7 can actually describe in words. Okay, right, and you can see that this coalition is actually reasonable deliberative coalitions in the sense that V1 is closer to A than she is to R, right, and V2 is closer to A than she is to R, and V3 is closer to A than she is to R, right? So this is V3 VA, this is V3 VR. So every agent approves the proposal that their coalition puts forward. Okay, so what can we say about, so if this is a successful outcome of deliberation, right? So we have two coalitions of size 3, one coalition of size 1, so 7 agents all together. So majority supported would mean to have an outcome supported by 4 agents. Can we possibly have a coalition of size 4 here? Okay, so what's your sense of things? Can anyone identify a proposal that could be supported by 4 agents?
P.
P, good. Right, so proposal P, V2, V3, V4, V5 would form potentially this majority coalition. Right, so if they were not limited by my stupid transition rules, right, and if they could just do whatever they like, they could actually form that coalition. Right, so now let's look at our transition rules and see which transition rules allow them to do that and which transition rules don't. Okay. So the first observation is that here we have no single agent transitions, right? So there's no agent that can move from the collision to any other existing collisions, right? So for instance, if you look at agent V4, maybe V4 would want to move to this collision that supports A, right? So at least so V4 might consider that. But now V4 is too far from A, right? So the distance between V4 and A is bigger than the distance between V4 and R. So for V4, it's not a feasible move, right? And of course, similarly for the agents here, right? So V7 can't move to this collision because B is too far. So V7 can't move to this collision because A is too far. Okay, so what the first collision can plausibly do, it can change its position. So we can allow a transition like that. So this collision can change its position from A to A prime, right? And then all agents in that collision would still support it, right? So that's possible, right? And then maybe V4, after that happens, V4 would be able to join that collision, right? Okay, so that's one possibility. So we're not going to talk much about this change the position collisions in this talk, but this is certainly a possibility here. So another thing to note is that there are no merge transitions here. No two collisions can merge, right? So for instance, these two large collisions, there isn't any point in this among my proposal points that they could merge around, right? So for instance, it's not the case that they can all merge around P because V1 and V6 don't like P. They're closer to R than they are to P. So merge transitions are not possible, right? So P is majority supported. But what we have, so what we have is we could potentially have a compromise transition around P. So the compromise would involve these two collisions, the collision around A and collision around B. So two agents from each collision would abandon the existing collision and form a collision jointly around B. So that would be a compromise transition. It would be a valid compromise transition because all these four guys approve P, and it would be a collision of size 4, which would be an improvement for each of them. Okay, so the question I want to ask is, in what spaces, what kind of transitions guarantee success? Okay, and for single agent transition, so the answer is kind of very negative. In single agent transition may fail to succeed even in one dimension, right? And this is an easy way to see that. So let's look at this metric space where we have 3 proposals, A, B, C. We have a collision around A, collision around B, collision around C. Right? And it's easy to see here that B is actually supported by the majority. Right? So majority of voters prefer B to the status quo, to the reality. Right? But if these are the current collisions, right? So single agent transitions are not going to get us there. So why is that the case? Well, an agent who is currently sitting in a collision that supports C would not move to B because he is currently in collision of size 3. And if he moves, he would be in a collision of size 3 again. So not an improvement, right? So not worth it to him, right? And agents who sit around B, they can't move to the collision that supports C, right? Because on the other hand, of course, that would put them in a bigger collision, but that proposal is too radical for them, right? So they're closer to R than to the proposal of that collision, right? So they wouldn't want to move, right? So single agent transitions are not going to bring about a majority collision somewhere to the left of R, right? So single agent transitions are not very interesting in that regard. On the other hand, if we are just sitting in one dimension, it's enough to consider follow transitions, right? So remember, follow transitions are when two collisions merge and they merge around the proposal of one of these collisions. So in particular, in these examples, the two collisions on the right, so the collision around C and collision around B, they could merge around B, right? So these agents as a group can move to the left, right? So if they move as a group, this results in a collision of size 5. So that makes them happy, right? And they actually approve B, right? So B is certainly much less radical than the change they support, but it's still preferable to them compared to the status quo. So they're happy to do that. Okay, and in general, not just in this example, but in general, in one dimension, follow transitions converge. Right? right? And an easy way to see that is first we can observe that no collision can possibly span 0, have members both to the left of 0 and to the right of 0, right? Because there is no proposal that can be supported both by the left-wing guys and by the right-wing guys, right? So some of them would prefer out to that proposal in any case, right? So collisions come in two flavors. There are collisions on the left and collisions on the right, right? And if we have, for instance, two positive collisions like in this picture, they could always merge around the less radical proposal, right? So in the end of our process, so if our process consists of follow transitions only, so if we converge, this means that we have at most two collisions, one positive and one negative, right? And at least, so one of these collisions would have to be a majority collision, right? So one of these collisions would have to contain at least half of the agents, right? So in one dimension, just follow transitions are sufficient for convergence, right? And we can mix up follow and single agent transitions, so we can allow both kinds of transitions, right? And that won't break this result, right? Because so the argument here doesn't require follow transitions to be exclusive if we have any kind of alternating sequence of follow and single agent transitions. So in any case, if we converge, we'll have at most two collisions, and therefore one of them supports a majority supported proposal. Okay, any complaints about this proof? So far, so good? Okay, good. Okay, but now if we try to move beyond one dimension, so if we're in two dimensions, then single agent transitions and also follow transition may fail to succeed. Okay, so this is a very simple example. So here we have two collisions. One is a collision around A, another one is a collision around B, and all these agents would be very happy to sit at B, right? So all my red dots prefer P to R. But this proposal, right? So it's not the case that agents on the left approve B. It's not the case that agents on the right approve A. So they can't just follow each other. So the left collision can't follow the right collision can't follow the left collision, right? So if they were to form a compromise, it would have to be different from the original proposals. So they can merge around B, but they can't merge around A or B, right? So single agent and follow transitions may be insufficient. Okay, so where are they sufficient? So you can ask, in what kind of metric spaces are merge transitions sufficient? Well, if you look at trees, so if you look at trees as geometric spaces, then just merge transitions actually sufficient for success, right? So when I talk about trees as metric spaces, so this is the picture I have in mind. So I have a tree, potentially weighted tree. Each edge is associated with a distance. So proposals is a subset of vertices of this tree. Each agent also sits at some vertex of this tree. So distances are measured along this tree, right? And then, so I ask if agents can converge using merge transitions, right? And then the answer is yes, right? And the reason why the answer is yes is if there is a majority supported proposal, then I claim that one of the children of the root would be a majority supported proposal, right? Because if you think about this proposal P, then everyone who sits in the tree rooted at P actually prefers P to R, right? So all agents sitting in kind of various collisions in children of P, right? So any pair of these collisions can have a merge transition where they form a compromise around P, right? And then other collisions in that subtree can join them one by one, right? So and on the other hand, it's clear that agents who sit in this subtree and agents who sit in this subtree can't compromise, right? So whatever is approved by agents here is not approved by agents here, right? So if there is a potential point of compromise, majority supported compromise, it has to be in one of the children, and it's an easy way for agents in that subtree to reach that point by mergers, okay? Right, and also you can note that just follow transitions are not enough. You genuinely need mergers because, for instance, if at the beginning you have a collision at A and a collision at B, right? So they can't accept each other's proposals, right? So the guys at A are too far from B So if you think of these edges as being unit distance, then the distance to B is 4 and the distance to the root is 3. So the agents from here can't move to here, the agents from here can't move to here, but what they can do is join forces at B. So mergers are sufficient on trees. But on the other hand, mergers are not sufficient in 2 dimensions. Right? So if you look at this picture, right, and this is a modification of a picture from a couple of slides before. So still here, P is a majority supported proposal. Right? So we have 6 agents altogether. 4 of them could potentially support P, but currently they're sitting in this left coalition and right coalition. And to form a coalition around P, well, they can't achieve it by merge, right? Because these 2 agents at the bottom would veto the merge. They prefer R to P, right? So just merge transitions wouldn't allow the agents who approve P to get together at P, right? And to form that coalition around P, we need what, remember, we call it a compromise transition, right? Where agents from both coalitions who like P actually form a coalition around P, right? So this illustrates why we need compromise transitions. Okay, so how powerful are compromise transitions, right? And here's what I think is kind of the most technical interesting result in this paper. So my claim is if the proposal space is RD, if any point in RD is a potential proposal, then this 2-way compromise is actually sufficient, right? So compromises among 2 coalitions can help agents identify a majority supported proposal, or just more broadly, the most supported proposal. Any sequence of compromise, okay, so let me make this claim more formal. So suppose we have a sequence of compromise transitions, right? And then it stops because there are no more compromise transitions available. I claim that at this point, there is a coalition in my deliberative coalition structure whose supported proposal is one of the most supported proposals, right? And this holds for any dimension D. I'm going to prove it in 2 dimensions. So it will be slightly hand-wavy, but not too far from the actual proof. So I'll prove it in 2 dimensions, but the proof actually generalizes. It's just easier to visualize it in 2 dimensions. Okay, so here's the proof idea. So suppose I'm at this point when no more compromises are available, right? So now I'm looking at my coalition structure. I ask how many coalitions are there? Suppose I'm left with just 2 coalitions, but none of them supports a majority supported proposal, right? And that's impossible because if I have 2 coalitions, they can always compromise. So we can look at this majority supported, the most popular proposal. We can take all agents from the first coalition who support it. We can take all agents from the second coalition who support it, and we can bring them together into a coalition around that most supported proposal. And that would be a valid compromise transition, right? So they can't get stuck without identifying that most supported proposal, right? So if I ended up with 2 coalitions, this means that one of them is actually a coalition around a most supported proposal. Good. Okay, so now suppose I somehow ended up with more than 2 coalitions, 3 or more, yet none of them is a coalition, none of them is supporting a most popular proposal. And I'm going to get a contradiction. Right? So suppose I have 3 or more coalitions. Right? So in this case, what I'm going to argue is that either there is a single agent deviation in which some agent can join one of the maximum size coalitions, or else there are 2 coalitions that can merge. Right? And kind of the first one is a single agent deviation, the second one is a merge deviation. Both can be thought of as special cases of compromise transitions. Okay, so why is that the case? Well, let's look at my maximum size coalition. Right, so in this picture, my maximum size coalition is this coalition of 5 voters who form a coalition on some proposal A. So just geometrically, let me draw a line between A and R, and let me draw another line that is perpendicular to this AR line and goes through its middle. Okay, so now by construction, remember all agents in this coalition around A, they all sit above that line, right? So preferring A to R geometrically means exactly being on one side of this line, being closer to A than to R, right? So this line nicely separates my agents from R. Okay, good. let me now move this line to R. Okay, so I've got my new line now going through R. Right, and now let me consider two cases. One case is I have some agents who sit above this line, who sit on the same side of this line as A does. So for now, let me assume that no one sits exactly on this line, right? And later I'll say what to do if that's not true. But suppose no one is sitting on the line, right? So first option is there are some agents not in this A collision who still sit on the same side of this line as A collision does. Then here's what I'm going to do. Right? So this is my picture. I'm going to identify a new point, A prime, somewhere on this segment, very, very close to R, so that when now I draw a new line parallel to my original line and through the middle of this A prime R segment, right? So then this line will still have all these points on one side of it. Right? And because I have a finite number of points, I can choose A prime close enough to R that this line would be very close to my original line and still have all these points on one side of it. Right? And now this new line separates all these agents from R, right? And it goes to the middle of R A prime. And this means that all these agents actually approve A prime, including this guy from the other collision. Right? And now I have a compromise move where this large collision and this one guy from the other collision form a new collision around A prime. Right? They all prefer A prime to R because geometry, because they all sit on the same side of this line, and therefore it's a legal compromise where they all form a collision around A prime. It's a slightly bigger collision, and everyone in that collision supports A prime. Right? So that's one possibility. And in fact, this argument kind of works even if one of these agents also sits right on this line, because what I can then do is to rotate this line very, very slightly so that this point is now on the same side of this line as the A collision, and then I'm in this situation again. Right? And this small rotation always exists because the number of points is finite. Okay, so that's one possibility when there's someone on the right side of this line. Another possibility is there's all other agents on the other side of this line. Right? And because I have at least 3 collisions, this means I have 2 collisions on the other side of this line. Right? And then kind of by the same argument, I can draw another separating line. I can find another proposal very close to R, but not quite at R, such that these 2 collisions can compromise over that proposal. Right? So by the same geometric considerations, I can now find a compromise that would enable these 2 collisions to merge around this new compromise point. Right? So either someone can join the biggest collision, or else there exists a merge. Right? So if there are 3 collisions left, there's still a compromise available. Right? So that's a contradiction. Okay. So in an arbitrary. Okay. So what do I need for this argument to go through? Right? So this argument goes through as long as I can find these proposals very close to R that agents can form compromises against. Right? So this theorem holds. So it certainly holds if the proposal space is all of RD. It also holds if the proposal space is some dense subset of RD. So for instance, if it's QD rather than RD, this argument still goes through. Right? I should just be able to pick these points close enough to the point of origin. However, if my space of proposals is sparse, which may indeed be the case in real life, so remember we are thinking of these proposals as political positions, right? And it may be very difficult for you to articulate a policy proposal that is somewhere halfway between whatever, cafes should be open, but gyms should not be open, right? So it would be difficult to describe what the intermediate position is, right? So if the number of available positions is small, right? So this argument no longer works. Right, so here's an example that sits in R3, but the number of available proposals is finite. Right, so the available proposals, okay, so this is the reality, status quo at 0. The proposals A, B, C, D, and P, right, and each proposal is currently supported by 2 guys. Right, so there's V1 and V5 supporting A, there's V2 and V6 supporting B, V3 and V7 supporting C, V4 and V8 supporting D, and there's one agent V9 here supporting E. right? And so they sit in these collisions. So I have 4 collisions of size 2, 1 collision of size 1, right? And there's a nice proposal P over here, right? And that proposal could potentially be supported by 5 agents, so 5 out of 9, a majority, right? But they can't get there by 2 compromises, right? Because if I just try to build a 2 compromise between, say, the collision round A, V1, V5, and the collision round B, V2, V6, right? So I can't build a feasible compromise around P, right? Because if just V5 and V6 were to move there, right, it would be just a collision of size 2, not an improvement over the current situation. So I would really need, in this case, at least 3 collisions to form that compromise. 2-way compromises are not enough. Right? So lesson here, if the proposal space is dense, 2 compromises are sufficient. And if agents are not as sophisticated at articulating complex proposals, right? So then they may need negotiation that involve many more collisions. Okay, so maybe a couple of words about the convergence and speed of convergence. Okay, so I talk about these processes as if they necessarily converge, right? And that's because they actually do. Right, so the first simple claim, so maybe obvious to some people in this audience, well, given the nature of this audience, any sequence of single agent merge and follow transitions actually terminates in a quadratic number of steps. So why is that? Well, there's an easy potential function. So let's define a potential function as a sum of squares of collision sizes. Right, and then it's easy to see that our rich get richer kind of dynamics increases this potential function at each step. Right, and this potential function has so the values it can take sit between 0 and n squared, so that at most n squared steps of my dynamics, right? So that's easy. Now, if I talk about compromise transitions, right, it's slightly more complicated because a compromise transition, so remember when agents break off from 2 existing collisions, form a new one and leave parts of the old collisions behind. So this may fail to increase this particular potential function. But you can define a different potential function, kind of a lexicographic potential function that would actually increase at each step. So convergence is still guaranteed. So we don't have a polynomial. So from this argument, we don't have a polynomial bound on the speed of convergence. So we can show that it terminates after at most, well, n to the power n steps. Well, it should rather be, well, n's Bell's number, so the number of partitions, but anyway, something that is super exponential in n, right? And we don't quite know if polynomial number of steps is enough. So we can strengthen this result slightly. So for this result for convergence in RD, so this geometric argument I showed you, so I can claim that there's a sequence of compromise transitions that actually converges in a quadratic number of steps. Right, and this is because this argument I showed you for 3 collisions. So there was a merge transition or, well, kind of a single agent transition. A single agent transition would be the change of position. Right, so there were transitions there that increased. So as long as there are 3 collisions still present, there's a transition there that increases this quadratic potential function. So if we tell agents, well, as long as there are 3 collisions, you're not allowed to do general compromises. You're allowed merge, follow, or single agent transitions with a change of position. And once you run out of those, and if you're down to 2 collisions, right, then you're allowed an arbitrary compromise. Then they're still able to converge to a majority supported outcome, and they're going to do so in quadratic time. Right, so this is kind of encouraging with respect to convergence. Okay, so I think I have still 3 minutes left, and then there's half hour for discussion, right? That's the instructions I've been given. Let me use these 3 minutes to tell you about another metric space where we only have very, very preliminary results. Right? And this is also a very natural metric space, it's d-Hypercube. Right? So potential proposal points are points in 0, 1 to the power d, so vertices of the hypercube. So their reality, the status quo, let's say it's a 0 point. So agents' ideal positions are also vertices of the hypercube. Right? So what we know about this metric space is that compromises, so 2-way compromises may fail, right? So that's actually a very easy example, maybe easier even than the example I already showed you, right? So suppose we have 5 agents, so agents are red dots now. So there's a collision here around this upper edge, which supports this proposal over here. right? So both agents in that collision prefer this point to 0, right? So there's a collision of size 2 here. Both agents in this collision prefer this point to 0, right? And there's a singleton here, right? And there's no transition here that would involve just 2 collisions. However, there's a collision among 3 agents that could potentially form if we would allow 3 collisions to negotiate, right? And this is this one, right? If you look at these 3 agents, they could form a collision around this bright yellow point because they all prefer that to the status quo, right? So that would be a majority. So this bright yellow point would be a majority supported proposal. But to get there, they need negotiation among 3 collisions. Right, so the question one can ask more generally, so what if we allow compromises allowing more than 2 collisions? Right, so suppose we allow as many as t collisions for some t greater than 2. Right, and our metric space is hypercube. So what value of t would be sufficient for convergence? Right, so what is the value of t that guarantees convergence to majorities to the most supported proposal in the hypercube? Right, and of course, a trivial upper bound is if you allow, okay, so if you can't have 2 distinct collisions supporting the same position, because then they could certainly merge, right? So merge transition is always available, right? So the worst case is you have a collision sitting at each point, and some of these collisions could potentially compromise. So if you allow negotiations that among as many as kind of number of vertices minus 1 collisions, because you don't have a collision at 0, right, then certainly kind of all agents who support this most supported proposal could just jump there in one step and form a collision around that proposal. Right, so that's an upper bound. If you allow negotiations among these many collisions, you'll get to majority supported outcome. But this seems like, allowing too many negotiators in the room, right? So what you want to ask is, can you have like smaller negotiations? Okay. So we have some very partial answers here. If we have 3 dimensions, then it's sufficient and necessary to have negotiations among 3 collisions, right? So the example from the previous slide showed that 2 is not enough, and we needed 3 to allow for at least 3 collisions to negotiate, right? And it's not a very difficult proof to show that 3 is actually sufficient, right? And from that, our conjecture for some time was that it's sufficient to allow d collisions to negotiate. So if we are in dimension d, so then by allowing d collisions to negotiate, we can always guarantee success, right? And then we tried to prove it for d equal 4. And as we were trying to prove it, we actually found a counterexample. So for d equal 4, the answer is 5. You may need 5 negotiating collisions to get to successful outcome, right? And generally, well, I think the honest answer is we don't know. So we have a lower bound, which is kind of like example from the previous slide, which says we need at least d negotiating collisions, where d is the dimension. We have an upper bound that is a very slight improvement over the trivial upper bound, which is, so we can improve it roughly by a factor of 2, which is very unimpressive, I would say, right? So the open question is whether we can close this gap, right? So whether we can somehow argue that negotiations by smaller groups are sufficient for convergence on the hypercube. Right, so there are further open questions. So for instance, kind of going back to RD, so away from hypercube and back to RD. So are there simple transitions that ensure convergence when proposal space is a subset of RD? So in particular, you can ask if D compromises are sufficient for arbitrary discrete subset of RD. We don't know, right? So, or kind of again, thinking of RD. So how rich should a space be for 2 compromise transitions to succeed, right? So RD itself is enough, Q to the power D is enough. So can we still guarantee success for something that is even sparser than Q to the D? Right? Or kind of at a more technical level, in RD, kind of we have this kind of potential-based bound on convergence, right, which is exponential. So can it really be as bad as exponential? Is the explicit sequence of compromise transitions that is actually exponentially long, right? So we don't have an example. So for all we know, maybe that's just a bad proof strategy and compromise transitions over converging polynomial thing. Okay, so that's all I have for today. So let me stop here, take questions. Thanks.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, you can simply unmute yourself and ask. Or if you are an attendee, you can just write something in the Q&A and then I can call upon you.
Yes, I have Q&A open, so feel free to start typing.
Maybe in the meantime, I can start with a question. So your agents are very nice because they're always looking for a compromise position. Is there a model of bargaining you can add to this? Because I might say that in order for me to move from my current position to the new one, I need a certain payment. How would things change?
Right. Okay. So that would give agents more flexibility, right? And so I would have to reason somehow about kind of their explicit utilities, right? So okay. So the short answer is I don't know. So what we try to think a little bit is making the compromise transitions more compromisey, right? Because right now, so I allow agents from two coalitions, C, P prime, CP and C prime P prime to form a compromise around some P star, and this P star can be arbitrary, right? So it doesn't have to be related to P and P prime. So for instance, it doesn't have to be between P and P prime in any sense, right? So it's not unreasonable to require that this compromise actually sits somewhere between P and P prime, right? And then I'm not sure if our argument goes through. I think it's not clear to me if our geometric argument will go through, but I didn't really try to go through that. But I think that's something one could explore, right? So requiring compromises to be actual compromises, actual intermediate positions.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Edith, you gave us lots of examples where under different types of transitions and in different metric spaces, convergence there was no convergence. This to me seems to raise an algorithmic question. If you have fixed your metric space and you have fixed the type of transition and you are given such an input and you ask, does it converge? Have you addressed, is it a meaningful algorithmic question and have you addressed it?
Yes, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. I think there is room for lots of PLS completeness results there, right? Which we haven't attempted to prove, but yes, that's the sense I'm getting out of that, right? So proving, kind of arguing something about convergence, so may be difficult. But yeah, so indeed the input is a kind of succinct and discrete object. So I have agents, I have coalitions, I have proposals, and I'm asking what can potentially happen in any sequence of transitions. Yes, I think it's an algorithmic question that would be worth asking. Is it a nice space or not? Are agents going to converge? Are they going to converge quickly? What can they potentially converge to? Right. So generally throughout this talk, I just focused on the question of whether they achieve majority supported outcome or not, right? And not which of the majority supported outcome. And in one of the examples I gave, right, so there were lots of them, right?
Yeah,
so one can ask is
the question is deciding convergence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So there's deciding convergence, and there's deciding if it's feasible to obtain convergence towards a specific outcome.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the answer, please?
Right. Okay. So I'm just saying that there are two algorithmic questions here, right? And one is simply if agents are guaranteed to converge to a majority supported outcome, right? And if there's potentially more than one, can they achieve convergence to a specific one?
Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's very interesting, right? And no, we haven't done anything on that. And my suspicion is that there are PLS hardness results lurking there.
Thank you.
Senthil, you want to unmute yourself and just ask your question?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I just wanted to know, is it possible that there could be an infinite sequence of compromises?
Okay, so I explain. Okay, so for the, let me go back in my slides a little bit. Okay, so here I argue that every sequence of two compromised transitions terminates after at most exponential number of steps. Right, and okay, so I stated that for two-way compromises, but actually, and I wasn't explicit about that, I'm sorry. The same argument and the same potential function shows that even if you allow multi-way compromises, you would still get termination of that most n to the power n steps. Right, so basically you get a sequence of collision structures, and we argue that you can't repeat collision structures. Right, and therefore, kind of you're guaranteed convergence with this form of compromises.
So you can't repeat anything that you've seen before.
Yeah.
I see. I got it. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, let's thank Edith again. And yeah, thank you very much for this very nice talk. And next week, we have Jean-François Raskin talking about subgame perfect equilibria. So until then, thank you for coming. Everybody, thank you for Edith for the talk. And we meet again next Friday.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Edith, for the talk. Yeah.